All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Universal CMS Summit. I'm going to take this out of the perch here just so I can have a little bit more FaceTime. So, yes, welcome to the Universal CMS Summit. This event, as Zen mentioned, has been the culmination of many months of effort. And today I want to pose a very simple question. The question I want to pose to all of us today is, what is content truly about? What is it that makes content tick? Is it the content itself? Is it the code? Is it the presentation layer? Is it the front end? My argument over the course of today, and my argument with the Universal CMS, is that content at the end of the day is about people. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about our agenda. So I want to talk a little bit about CMS today. I want to talk about where we are, why we find ourselves in this interesting inflection point in the history of the CMS. I want to talk about why Universal CMS, what is Universal CMS, what are some of the key tenets and the key components of a Universal CMS, and then I want to talk about some next steps and what the next generation of the Universal CMS and the CMS writ large looks like. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Preston. I've been at dotCMS for about 5 or 6 months. I've been in the CMS space for about 17 years. And it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today. Also because we are here in Quebec. Bonjour et bienvenue. Merci beaucoup. C'est un plaisir d'être ici avec tout le monde à la première Universal CMS Summit. Merci, allons-y. So what is Universal CMS, right? It's interesting because just a few days ago, I had a really fascinating conversation with my colleague, Ina Bosenko, who is currently catching up on sleep. And one of the things that has been really clear about the CMS market and the industry over the past, I would say 4 to 5 years, is that these labels, right, headless, monolithic, hybrid headless, composable, they're really becoming a little bit myopic. They're becoming very reductive. They're becoming very simplistic. They're not really capturing, in my view, a lot of what the CMS has to offer. The Universal CMS, at the end of the day, is about empowering people, the people that make content work, right? Because that's the whole reason we're in this business in the first place. There's really 4 tenets that I've called out when it comes to the Universal CMS. Number 1 is the ability to use any tech, any stack, any framework, any JavaScript that you might want to bring. That's what I mean by universally developable. Then there's also the concept of omni-channel editing, right? The ability for an editor on a content team, a compliance reviewer, accessibility reviewer, what have you, to be able to go in and actually take a look at content, preview content, apply workflows to it, schedule it, embargo it, and so on and so forth. But there are 2 other emerging important trends in the CMS market. One, of course, as we all know, is AI. And the second, of course, as we all know, is infrastructural agnosticism, being able to take your CMS anywhere. Any part of the architecture you should be able to take wherever you want to. The reason for this is that we've seen that headless CMSs are really good at enabling developers. They're really good at enabling technical folks, but they're not so good at enabling the marketers, the content teams, the content writers, and all the folks that work in the CMS as part of this nexus of collaboration that's very unique in the ecological world of software. The content management system occupies this very unique point in that we collaborate across a variety of different personas to come at the same goals, even though we have very different prerogatives and very different ways of doing that. But before I dive right in, let me just introduce dotCMS. dotCMS is a universal CMS. We help global enterprises scale, create, do all sorts of really great things with their content across brands and franchises and tenants. Quick look at our architecture for those of you who are interested. Won't dwell on that too much. But we have some really great customers. We've got some really awesome logos. And dotCMS, we've got a really, really amazing set of folks who trust us and who have trusted us with their vision for a long time. Last quarter, we actually were able to land an additional customer, partially thanks to the Universal Visual Editor, as well as our Universal CMS vision. So Universal CMS is something that's taken hold not only among the vendors in our industry, not only among a lot of the consultancies in our industry, but also among the customers who are, of course, those who pay our paycheck. So what is going on with CMS today? Well, 4 years ago, I wrote an article for CMS Wire that was called Why We Need a New Grand Compromise in Content Management. I showed this slide about 7 years ago at DrupalCon Vienna to discuss the problems that we see with the traditional poles of headless versus traditional. The fact of the matter is that content teams and developer teams have very different perceptions and very different perspectives on what headless means, on what traditional means, on what omnichannel means, on what multimodal means. And we're dealing with two very interesting centrifugal trends. The first is editors need to do more with their content. And it doesn't matter where that content ends up. They have to be able to do everything that they do today with a website on things that are not websites. Number two, developer teams have a huge array of JavaScript frameworks to contend with these days. SvelteKit, you've got Astro, you've got Next.js, you've got Nuxt, you've got Vue.js, Angular. Now, these two dual pressures are leading to a situation where neither party is happy. Neither developers are happy, and nor are content teams. So about 4 years ago, I wrote this article, which was the most read article on CMS Wire for several weeks, which is that, people love headless if they're building from a developer mindset. If they're building a huge implementation, they've got the technical chops to do it, they're fine. But oftentimes what you find is that a lot of the workflows and a lot of the approaches that content editors have been used to for the years and decades, namely visual editing, namely approvals, workflows, time machine preview, for example, these are all things that become much, much harder in a headless environment. And we've been seeing a lot of folks talk about this in the market. Most prominently, we are joined here by Dean Barker of Valtech, who has talked about the race to the middle, something I like to call convergent evolution, a rebundling that reverses, at least to some extent, the unbundling that took place with the advent of the headless CMS. And we're seeing now, especially from other sides of the CMS equation, right? Those who work in commerce, those who work in composable commerce, that there's a lot of concern right now from investors, board members, and also from the rank and file of these companies about the ability to capture more value that's end-to-end and not just limited to a single persona. So what's interesting is that the historic static web CMS, as I mentioned earlier, really occupied this very unique niche biologically within the software ecosystem. Unlike CRM tools, unlike CDPs, unlike HCM, unlike all these three-letter acronyms that represent verticals, the CMS actually serves a variety of distinct personas that all have very different needs. But the static web CMS achieved something that was really unique, which was a compromise, a grand compromise between editorial teams, content teams, and developer teams, engineering teams, to be able to say, hey, you know what? If I give up this level of control and you give me this level of control back, then we can have a great working relationship and be good to go in the future. With the advent of headless CMS, of course, things changed, right? And we know from customers, we know from folks that work in the CMS space that actually use our software, that the headless CMS has not really been that great for the editorial side of the house. And by the same token, the monolithic CMS or the traditional CMS side of the house has not really grown or matured to the point where they're providing a truly enriching experience for developers. This is one of the big reasons we're seeing this reconvergence in the market. What we're seeing is this counter-reaction to this polarization in the market. People are saying, yeah, I like headless CMS, it's good for my developers, but what do I do with my visual editing? What do I do with my preview? What do I do with my embargoed content, my scheduled content? And by the same token, developers are fleeing from the monolithic CMS generation in droves because they see that headless CMS has a better developer experience. But if you look at the thing that ties all of this together, the primary element that unites all of these things is the idea of headless visual editing. And indeed, today, you see a lot of our vendors in the CMS market beginning to go in this direction. React Bricks, for example, refers to them no longer as just a headless React CMS. They refer to themselves as a headless React CMS with visual editing. So a lot of these headless CMSs are becoming less purely headless than they were before, and so on and so forth as well with the monolithic CMS generation that's also becoming increasingly headless. And it's clear through all of these machinations and through all of these sales pitches and through all of this discourse about which is better, headless or monolithic, which is better, traditional or not, what's getting lost is the fact that the static web-only CMS was always about honoring all of the distinct personas we have at the utmost. And that's why the Universal CMS is so important. We're talking about restoring the balance and the equilibrium that led to the web CMS becoming such a great first generation of the CMS, but now we have to do it for a lot more. We have to do it for omnichannel. We have to do it for tech agnostic. We have to do it for JavaScript. We have to do it for React Native. We have to do it for so many of these technologies that are emerging. So Universal CMS is really about three primary things, which is this idea that you should be able to universally edit anything anywhere, right? You should be able to edit anything anywhere, regardless of whether it ends up in a Roku app or an in-store display or a digital sign that's on AWS IoT. It should be able to actually work with any of those tools. And there's a lot of interesting proofs of concept out right now around doing visual editing and visual preview and all of those things for things like extended reality interfaces that are virtual reality driven, or for things like chatbots that are voice bots that are voice interfaces rendered textually so that you can actually preview content in a visual way with that spoken content. But also it means agnosticism, right? We've talked for many, many years now in the CMS world, especially in the content space, about the need for omnichannel and that single source of truth for content and that really great syndication layer. But what about the fact that we need the same thing for developers? So one of the really interesting things about all of this is that the CMS is gradually becoming less rooted to a single approach, a single persona, a single architecture, and instead becoming all-encompassing across all of them. And we see examples of this in the history of the web and in the history of the CMS. Let's rewind all the way back to the late 1990s and the early 2000s, right? What we had back in those days was a simple static CMS that had FTP, right? Had some sort of file server that you would push files to, and that was about it. But there was this really clear architectural separation of concerns, this distinction that characterized the split between developer-owned concerns and more marketer-owned concerns. And you see that in the server versus client separation of concerns that you see in the monolithic CMS. Well, in comes Universal JavaScript, and of course, all of that goes away. For those of us who grew up with JavaScript before the Node.js era, one of the most interesting things about JavaScript in those days is that you really were able to just poke at the page, poke at little areas of the document object model. But what's really fascinating about the way that Universal JavaScript emerged is that front-end developers said, no, that's a really bad approach. Why should I manage my code on the server side and on the client side separately? Why should those two things not be together? Ultimately, what JavaScript developers were looking for when they built things like Node.js, built things like Universal JavaScript, was an easier, more graceful way to interact with their code. And that's exactly what content teams and developer teams are looking for right now when it comes to CMS. When you think about this separation of concerns, right, the notion that we're going to manage our code by component and not by these arbitrary assets that lie outside of what our actual atomic focus is, that really moves things in a very interesting direction. And indeed, the headless CMS generation latched onto Universal JavaScript. They said, yes, let's get rid of this distinction between client and server, because having components that straddle both makes a lot of sense. But what this did is it actually instituted a new architectural separation of concerns, which is of this notion between this difference between content as data and content as presentation. No longer could content teams have any insight or input or impact into how that content is presented. Only the developer side of the house could actually have that input. So when we think about separations of concerns, right, the whole reason why Universal JavaScript emerged was to get rid of what developers felt was an arbitrary separation of concerns that limited their work. The way that we see the separation of concerns appear in CMS is actually very different. Whereas technical separations of concerns and architectural separations of concerns are things that you can see on an architectural diagram, a functional separation of concerns where now you have content folks and developers who can't do their work as effectively, that's not something that really shows up in a schematic as easily. Because what the architectural separation of concerns in headless CMS did was to say that content is just data for the content editors, right? For presentation, that's not really your wheelhouse. It's now more for developers. But what we're hearing as a fully fledged protest, a unified reaction to this idea, is the fact that content teams need to own both. This is part of their day-to-day job and part of the reason they get a paycheck. The headless CMS was interesting because it led to a loss of a huge number of workflows from the content teams docket, namely things like content preview, content approval, embargoed content, scheduled content, template management, layout management. All of these things that came so easy in the static web CMS now suddenly are incredibly difficult in the headless CMS. There was a conversation I had with an enterprise company a few weeks ago that mentioned that they had bought a headless CMS, were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for this headless CMS, but then they were handed a statement of work to build headless visual editing into the platform, something that they should have already had in the product to begin with. They ended up canceling the contract, canceling the subscription, and moving back into a monolithic architecture. So when you think about these workflows, what a lot of these content folks, these content teams are saying about headless CMS is that this is no longer working for us. We need something better. And what is that something? That something is a universal CMS that allows for content teams to inflict control over the presentation and the data layer of their content, and also allows them to work directly with developers on these shared, mutually driven, mutually prioritized concerns like headless preview, content approval, and so on and so forth. So what you're ending up with here is exactly the same thing that we saw with universal JavaScript, right? Just as JavaScript developers said, I'm going to make my component go across client and server because this architectural separation of concerns makes no sense to me. We're seeing the same exact trend in Universal CMS where content teams and developer teams alike who have to work together very closely are saying, this doesn't make any sense to me. This architectural separation of concerns that says that I am just a data enterer, right? I am nothing more than a data entry person is going away because of this reaction against all of this. What we need now is co-ownership, cross-functional components that straddle all of this. And this is the key foundation of our universal visual editor. So what exactly makes a universal CMS a universal CMS? Well, there's a architecture that I put together specifically for the dotCMS vision for universal CMS. This is our universal CMS. What we're focusing on is delivering content to and editing content in and developing content for a variety of different front ends that might be on the web or off the web, that might be web renderable, or might be something that uses some other technology. Because this is the direction that we have to move for both omnichannel and technology agnosticism. In addition, we're focusing on universal visual editing as well as universal infrastructure. Being able to take your stack, decouple it apart from each other, put it wherever you want to. These are all really key things that developers and DevOps folks want. What I believe very strongly, and I agree with Dominic Quinter here, who's also in the room with us, that the headless CMS is not always the right answer for everything. It's progress, right? And headless first is the way of the future. Don't get me wrong. Headless and composable are here to stay, right? But it has to be done in a way that is a little bit less decapitated than what it is right now. And that's why I firmly believe that as of next year, we'll start to see the shift over towards the new generation, the third wave, as Ryan Bikini likes to say, of the CMS. There's 4 components of a universal CMS in my view, but I'm very happy also to discuss with all of you, explore what the universal CMS should become. Universal editing. Way back in the day when headless CMS first started out, those of you who remember Contentful way back in the day, when you used to do stuff like visual site building and visual editing and visual assembly within the context of a hybrid headless or monolithic CMS, you have a drag and drop WYSIWYG editor. This is really cool stuff, right? But move to the headless CMS and suddenly you're stuck with all these black boxes. You have no idea what they relate to. You have no idea even what the page that you're looking at relates to within the CMS. And so this really, kind of calls into question, right, a lot of the investments that a lot of these content teams are making. When they've been losing a lot of the functionality they've been used to, what actually happens to that content? And what actually happens to the marketing teams and the content teams that are responsible for it? The other thing that I think is really important to understand just very briefly here is that preview fidelity obviously is very different across a variety of different folks. What we know is that when your CMS controls the front end, when it controls that presentation layer, it's really easy to do visual editing. But let's talk about, let's say, an Alexa device or a pure voice interface. Things get a little trickier. And that's where the next challenge of universal editing for the CMS comes into play. How do we enable for content teams and developer teams to implement a preview that goes beyond the website, that goes beyond the JavaScript single page app, that goes beyond even the notions of what a website or a web app is? How do we preview spoken content? How do we preview spatial content in addition to textual, written, and visual content? And how do we enable developers to do all of those things? So we're not only thinking about tech-agnostic CMS and the ability for a CMS to do universal editing across React, Angular, Vue.js, Svelte, what have you. We're also thinking about this from a cross-channel perspective. If you're building, for example, a virtual reality interface in WebXR, or if you're building a cross-platform native application for iPad and iPhone in React Native, or if you're building something for a Roku application, right? We should be able to preview, approve, look at compliance for, assess, observe all of the content regardless of where it ends up. Not just the website, not just the website. So our universal visual editor is interesting, and I've heard a lot of folks talk about how universal CMS is just monolithic headless, right? And the charitable interpretation of that is true. right? What dotCMS has is we have a universal visual editor that not only straddles both monolithic and headless architectures, so you can use our native presentation layer alongside headless presentation layers, but it also does that across all of the headless layers as well. So if you're building on React, Angular, and or Vue, you can use the exact same universal visual editor to administer and work with that content. So later today, Freddy Montes and Arcadio Quintero are going to be giving a talk about Universal Visual Editor. I won't be able to give a live demo today because I'm not on my laptop, but go over to their session later today for a live demo. That's going to be a lot better than mine. So join Freddy for that later on. So universal editing is definitely the first step, right? Because this is the need and the requirement that so many people have of the CMS from the very get-go. But what are some of the other things coming down the chute? What are some of the other considerations that we need to think about for Universal CMS? Well, there's really three things, right? And the headless CMS and, for many intents and purposes, the hybrid headless CMS, monolithic CMS, has actually done this first one to some degree, right? Now you look at a lot of the monolithic CMSs, the older generation of CMSs, they have SDKs, they have APIs, they have all the tools that developers need to get going, but they still are missing a lot of the visual editing interfaces or a lot of the other interfaces that make up the workflows that editors need. But we also need to think about the future of AI. Universal generation. I believe in a not too distant future where people will be able to do more than just things like text and image generation. They'll be able to do things that are much richer within the CMS that apply to workflows that go well outside the wheelhouse of what AI is capable of right now in the CMS. And finally, deployment. As we know, headless architectures are hosted differentially, right? You have headless platforms in Netlify or Vercel or some of these hosting providers, but you also should be able to host your CMS wherever you want to as well. And also the constituent members of that stack should be hosted anywhere that you would like, whether that's AWS Amplify or Netlify or Vercel or the cloud providers that we know. So with that, I'm going to conclude here today by just talking a little bit about where do we go from here. I'd love to talk about universal editing with all of you today, universal CMS. I'd love to talk with you about some of the other tenets of the universal CMS as I see it. But as I mentioned, this is becoming a very pivotal moment for our industry. What we're hearing from the market in terms of this reaction away from the somewhat myopic or somewhat reductive vision of CMS as solely being bipolar between on one side headless and traditional on the other, is that we've lost a lot of the nuances about why people want to use a CMS in the first place and why it is that content teams and developer teams find it ever harder to work together in today's day and age. It doesn't just have to do with the surrounding architectures of what we build. It doesn't just have to do with the vagaries of React and Vue.js versus the vagaries of AR, VR versus chatbots. It really has to do with how we build our systems themselves. And it's very clear that neither architectural pole serves the content team or the developer team 100% well. At the end of the day, content is not about code. Content is not about layouts. Content is not about navigation tools. Content is not about all of those things. What content is about people. And the reason why the CMS became such a pivotal and such an important tool and such an important representation of the cross-persona prospect that's available in our software industry is because of its unique focus on enabling every single person that ever touches that CMS. And at the end of the day, we're serving this content to the end users, the people that we serve. Why shouldn't we serve the people who use our CMS as effectively? Content is about people, and that's where I'll end today. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. So happy to answer some questions, any sort of thoughts or comments, and then I will need to hop off the stage here pretty quick. I'll repeat the question as well for the recording. Go ahead, Jeff.
How do you see, in a world where all that crazy stuff is going on, all those different endpoints, how much work do you think is realistically ahead of a team that needs to deliver different experiences on all of those things? Is it even possible to build a tool that can generate all the things?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I'll repeat the question, or I'll try to re-summarize it. But the question was, with all of this chaos with all of this growth in channels and also needs and requirements. How realistic is it for a team to be able to generate all those assets or to be able to actually touch all of those touch points, right? I think the question varies from customer to customer, from CMS user to CMS user, right? When you think about the long tail of the digital transformation timeline, there are a lot of companies still remaining today, even in 2024, that haven't even begun to think about a CMS for their website, right? They're still using stuff like front page or things of that nature. But then you have the more forward-looking ones that are really clearly thinking about omni-channel, thinking about tech agnosticism, but also really kind of hamstrung. And to answer this question, I want to do it in two parts. The first is, I worked with on the side, I sometimes work as an architectural consultant. And about 5 years ago, I worked with a very large company, very large corporation in Japan. It's a household name, Fortune 500 company. And they had 10 different websites, right? One of which was on their core CMS. The others were all on React, Vue, Angular. Every single brand had their own distinct front-end application. I think it really depends on the unique characteristics of each team, right? Because you clearly had a brand team for each individual brand at this company that also had access to a very large technology team, right? So they had an engineering team on the brand and they had a content team on the brand. And so as a result, they were able to really push forward all these things. But of course, what happened was, what happens to the ability to forge that single source of truth across all of those different implementations where content ends up, right? That's where things get really interesting. And to answer your question more directly, Jeff, I don't think that it's realistic necessarily to do this for, let's say, every single possible channel and every single possible generatable asset, right? But I do think that there is a threshold. There is that minimum viable threshold, that sort of level in the hierarchy of needs where we know that people are going to want to use that kind of stuff. And this is especially true of things like mobile apps. This is especially true of things like, I know people are really interested, especially in public sector and aviation, around doing things like serving content through chatbots that are previewable or through voice bots that are previewable. So the use cases keep growing. And I think that, obviously one system to rule them all is what people are looking for. Can we achieve that dream? The jury's out. That's what today's for. All right, let's go to Dean next, and then I will have to end so we can talk afterwards.
So do you think that this is a technical hurdle or a marketing perception framing hurdle?
I think it's both, right? I think in some ways it's very similar to, and this is very funny, Dean, so just to repeat the question. Is this a marketing challenge or is this more of a technical challenge? And you know what? Let me actually quote somebody who is in the headless CMS world on this, right? Headless CMSs, I forget who it was, but one of the CEOs of one of the major headless CMSs had this to say, which is that it is about the technology. It is about also the market, right? It is also about customer education. It is also about letting the market know that headless isn't the answer necessarily for all of their end-all be-all solutions, that monolithic is also no longer the answer. How do we move beyond headless and beyond monolithic in this myopic framing to the point where we can say that we have a CMS that fully suits each of these personas in uniquely optimal ways? It's both. So, I know Standity has invested a lot in customer education as one example. I know there are a lot of folks that care a lot about customer education. The market needs to be educated, but I do think that there is a significant R&D challenge here as well that we have to build up. And we're already seeing that. Thanks to dotCMS, Universal Visual Editor. We're seeing Adobe Experience Manager talk about their Universal Editor. I know Kenneco's got some really interesting stuff in the works too. So exciting times ahead. All right, with that, I do need to stop, but thank you all so much and looking forward to the rest of the day. Merci.